The wind howled like a grieving widow across the jagged peaks of the Montana Rockies, tearing at the brittle pines that clung to the mountainside. In the dead of a February night, Amos Creed stumbled out of his cabin, his breath clouding in the frigid air, drawn by a strange creak that pierced the silence. His lantern flickered, casting trembling shadows on the snow, and then he saw her, a woman, blonde hair tangled and glinting like spun gold, hanging from the eaves of his roof. Her body swayed gently, a macabre pendulum in the moonlight, her wrists bound with coarse rope. The words, "Apache Lover," were carved into a wooden plank lashed across her chest, the letters burned black and jagged, as if branded by a vengeful hand. Amos froze, his heart hammering, the weight of years alone crashing into this moment of horror. Who was she? Why was she here, on his mountain, in his world of solitude? The questions clawed at him, but the truth, he would soon learn, was far darker than the storm raging around him. If you believe in kindness, second chances, and the power of redemption, please hit that like button, leave a comment, share this story, and subscribe to Kindness Speaks. Your support helps us share stories that touch the heart and inspire the soul. Amos was no stranger to isolation. For 12 years, he'd lived alone on this mountain, a grizzled man of 42 with a beard like iron filings and eyes that had seen too much of the world's cruelty. Once, he'd been a rancher, a husband, a man with dreams of a family and a future. But that was before the fire, before the night his wife, Clara, and their unborn child was stolen by flames that devoured their home. The official report called it an accident, a spark from a faulty lantern, but Amos knew better. He'd seen the tracks in the ash, the footprints of men who'd wanted his land and his life. He fled to the mountain, not out of cowardice but because the world below had nothing left for him. His cabin, a rough-hewn shelter of logs and stubborn wool, was his fortress against memory, against hope. He hunted, he chopped wood, he survived. But he never lived, not until that night, when the sight of the woman hanging from his roof shattered the numbness he'd built around his heart. She was alive, barely. Her pulse was a faint flutter beneath her icy skin when Amos cut her down, his hands trembling as he worked the rope free. Her face was pale, bruised, her lips cracked from the cold, but there was a fierce beauty in her features, like a statue weathered by time but unbroken. He carried her inside, laying her on the cot near the fire, wrapping her in every blanket he owned. The plank with its hateful words lay discarded outside, but its message burned in his mind. Apache Lover. The phrase was a slur, a condemnation, rooted in the old hatreds that still festered in the valleys below, where ranchers and townsfolk clung to grudges against the native tribes who'd once roamed these lands freely. Amos had no patience for such venom. He'd seen enough of division in his youth, growing up on the edge of reservation lands, where his father had traded with Apache families and taught him to see people, not labels. But this woman, whoever she was, had been marked by that hate, and now she was here, a mystery bleeding into his solitude. As the fire crackled, Amos tended to her. He warmed broth from the venison he'd cooked days before, spooning it carefully between her lips when her eyes flickered open for fleeting moments. They were green, those eyes, like the moss that clung to the rocks in spring, and they held a story he couldn't yet read. She didn't speak, not at first, and Amos didn't press her. He knew trauma, knew the way it locked words behind walls of fear. Instead, he watched, he waited, and he wondered, who had done this to her? The rope burns on her wrists told of struggle, the bruises on her arms spoke of violence, and the words on that plank screamed of a hatred so deep it had to be personal. Amos felt a stirring in his chest, a mix of anger and protectiveness he hadn't felt since Clara. He didn't know this woman, but she was in his care now, and that meant something. It meant he couldn't turn away, no matter how much his instincts screamed for him to stay hidden, to stay safe. Days passed, and the woman, whose name, he learned when she finally whispered it, was Lila, began to recover. Her voice was soft, halting, but it carried a strength that matched the fire in her eyes. She told him fragments of her story, each piece a shard of glass that cut deeper into Amos's understanding of the world he'd left behind. Lila was 30, a wanderer who'd come to Montana seeking a fresh start after a life of drifting. She'd fallen in love with a man named Tarek, an Apache artist who painted murals that told stories of his people's resilience. They'd met in a small town called Bitterroot, where Tarek's work had drawn both admiration and ire. Some locals saw his art as a challenge, a reminder of a history they'd rather forget. Lila, with her fierce heart and unyielding loyalty, had stood by him, defending his right to create, to exist. But love, she learned, was a dangerous thing in a place where old wounds never healed. A group of men, ranchers, she thought, though she never saw their faces clearly, had come for Tarek one night. They'd beaten him, left him for dead, and when Lila tried to protect him, they turned on her. She remembered the rope, the darkness, the pain. And then, somehow, she'd ended up here, on Amos's mountain. The story shook Amos, not just for its cruelty but for the way it echoed his own past. He'd seen men like that, men who hid their cowardice behind mob justice, who used hate to mask their fear. He'd lost Clara to men like that, though he'd never proven it. The guilt of failing her, of not being there when the fire came, had driven him to this mountain, and now here was Lila, a mirror to his pain, a chance to do what he couldn't do then. But helping her wasn't simple. The men who'd done this weren't likely to stop. If they'd gone to the trouble of leaving her here, branding her with their hate, they might come looking to finish what they started. Amos's cabin, his sanctuary, was no longer safe. And yet, he couldn't send her away. Not when her eyes held the same haunted look he saw in the mirror every day. Not when her presence stirred something in him, a flicker of purpose he thought he'd buried with Clara. Winter tightened its grip on the mountain, and with it came a creeping dread. Amos kept watch, his rifle close, his ears tuned to every snap of a twig, every rustle in the snow. Lila grew stronger, her body healing faster than her spirit. She helped with small tasks, chopping kindling, mending a tear in Amos's coat, her hands steady despite the shadows in her eyes. They didn't talk much, but a quiet understanding grew between them, born of shared survival. Amos taught her how to set snares for rabbits, how to read the wind for signs of a storm. Lila, in turn, shared stories of Tarek's art, of the way he'd painted the stars as if they were ancestors watching over the land. Her words painted pictures in Amos's mind, vivid and alive, and for the first time in years, he felt the weight of his loneliness ease. But the plank with its burned words sat in the corner of the cabin, a constant reminder of the danger lurking beyond the trees. One night, as a blizzard roared outside, Lila broke. She sat by the fire, her knees drawn to her chest, and wept. The tears came like a flood, carrying the grief of losing Tarek. The fear of what might come next, the shame of being marked by those hateful words. Amos sat across from her, his own heart cracking open. He wanted to tell her it would be all right, that she was safe, but he knew better than to lie. Instead, he told her about Clara, about the fire, the loss, the way he'd run to the mountain to escape the pain. It was the first time he'd spoken her name aloud in years, and the words felt like stones lifted from his chest. Lila listened, her tears slowing, and when he finished, she reached out, her hand resting on his. It was a small gesture, but it burned through the walls Amos had built, reminding him that connection, even in pain, was what made life bearable. The turning point came with the thaw. Spring crept up the mountain, melting the snow and bringing with it signs of pursuit. Tracks appeared near the creek, footprints, too many to be a lone hunter. Amos knew they were coming, the men who'd hurt Lila, who'd killed Tarek. He could feel their malice in the air, like a storm gathering strength. He and Lila had a choice: run deeper into the wilderness or face them. Running was what Amos had always done, but Lila's presence changed something in him. She wasn't Clara, but she was a chance to right a wrong, to protect someone who needed him. Lila, too, was tired of running. She wanted justice, not just for herself but for Tarek, for the love they'd been denied. Together, they made a plan, not to fight with guns or fists, but with truth. Lila remembered details, A scar on one man's hand, a name whispered in the dark. Amos knew the town, the sheriff who might listen if they could prove what had happened. They descended the mountain, a journey that felt like stepping back into a world Amos had sworn to leave behind. Bitterroot was a hard place, its streets lined with suspicion, but Lila's courage was a fire that wouldn't dim. They found allies, a young journalist hungry for a story, a tribal elder who'd known Tarek's family. The evidence mounted, a blood-stained rope found in a barn, a witness who'd overheard a drunken confession. The men who'd attacked Lila and Tarek were exposed, the names dragged into the light. It wasn't easy. There were threats, glares, moments when Amos thought the town would turn on them. But Lila's voice, steady and unyielding, carried them through. She spoke of Tarek, of his art, of the love that had been worth fighting for. And Amos, standing beside her, found his own voice, telling the town about Clara, about the fire, about the cost of silence. In the end, justice wasn't perfect. 2 of the men were arrested, but others slipped away, protected by wealth or connections. Yet something shifted in Bitterroot. Tarek's murals, defaced and hidden, were restored. Lila stayed, not as a victim but as a force, working with the journalist to tell stories of the forgotten, the silenced. Amos didn't return to the mountain. He built a new cabin, closer to town, where he could see Lila's light in the distance. They weren't lovers, not in the way people might expect, but they were family, bound by survival and the choice to face the dark together. The plank with its hateful words was burned in a fire they lit together, its ashes scattered to the wind. This story, if it's touched your heart, is a reminder that kindness and courage can heal even the deepest wounds. If Lila and Amos's journey moved you, please like, comment, and share this video. Subscribe to Kindness Speaks to keep these stories alive, because every voice matters, every story counts. And before we end, a special request, in the comments below, share a moment when kindness or a second chance changed your life or someone else's. Let's inspire each other with stories of hope.